Essential elements need to be taken into account, such as enabling technologies, adequate internet connection, but also sound, balanced regulatory framework. Beyond and beside an enabling infrastructure, which we agree is essential, sometimes in this context we forget that the first steps for allowing access is actually the creation and production of the content we want to enjoy. Creation remains a precondition of access, so any sustainable policy aimed at enhancing access to local content should also look at how it affects the creation side of the puzzle. We are aware that an important share of the local content that is shared on the internet is non-commercial in nature, created and shared without any purpose of economic gain. And we recognize it's very important to provide the right infrastructure, facilitating easy and speedy access to that content to the widest number of individuals around the globe through social networks and other UGC platforms that are functioning very well. On a parallel track, there are other kinds of local content that require complex and elaborated production mechanism supported by substantial human and financial resources. This is the case, for instance, of a local newspaper, a regional TV offering a full programming exclusively in the local language, a movie produced in an indigenous language. Professionals dedicating their lives to the creation and distribution of this kind of content need and deserve a reward for their output and incentives to keep delivering their essential contributions. So in this context, the copyright system plays a very important role because it establishes the rule of the game through which creators and other rights holders are able to make available local content through different channels and obtain a fair remuneration out of that endeavor. In addition to incentives, we must keep in mind that copyright system provides for a high degree of flexibility and adaptability. First of all, international treaties allow limitations and free uses, guaranteeing that interests of society and the general public are also taken into account. For instance, for the purpose of education, research, news reporting, and for the benefit of people with disabilities. Secondly, economic rights can be exercised in a variety of ways. Rights holders can freely opt for open licensing, such as Creative Commons, or free and open source software. These licensing schemes are gaining importance in the digital environment and represent the backbone of thriving platforms and online services. Among many possible examples, I think here we can cite Wikipedia, which is particularly relevant to the discussion on local content. It offers access to an immense variety of content that can be adapted and translated to address the needs of specific language communities. The platform, Wikipedia, works on the basis of a Creative Commons license, CC 3.0 by Share Alike, which is enabled by the exercise of economic rights. It works well within the copyright system, so these kind of platforms that are very powerful means for enabling the sharing of user-generated content are actually functioning within the current regulatory system, are not alternatives to copyright. So before giving the floor to our speakers, I would like to say a few words about the organization I have the pleasure to represent here today, the World Intellectual Property Organization. That is a United Nations agency with 191 member states, of course the majority of which are developing and least developed countries, and we work for them and with them to develop a balanced and effective international IP system. We often get to assist the governments around the world with their strategies to boost their national cultural production. So in this respect, I think it's for a better understanding of all the issues at stake, we think it's useful to hear directly from the people that are operating in the market. This is why we have put together a rich panel representing here three key players, namely broadcasters, movie producers, and news publishers, that are going to tell us how is the current system working for them, what are the major trends in the consumption channels, what are the challenges they are facing, and perhaps also share with us what are the kind of public policy that are needed to guarantee a healthy local content environment. Of course, each industry has its own characteristic and operates on the basis of very different business models. So we are going to actually hear most likely 3 different stories. And we are going to start with the European Broadcasting Union and its representative, Hayo Ruiz-Enhars, sorry for the pronunciation, followed by FIAP and one IFRA. At the end, of course, we'll reserve ample time for comments and questions. And each of them is going to introduce themselves. So, Hayo, the floor is yours. And
yes, thank you, Paolo, for this introduction. As co-organizer of this event, though not personally involved, I'd like to welcome you, of course, as well to this open forum. As I said before, my name is Hayo Ruiz-Enhars. I'm head of the intellectual property at the European Broadcasting Union. This is a union of all public radio and television broadcasters in Europe, which is about 75 or so member organizations in 50+ countries. So I represent the public broadcasting organizations, but since there's no commercial broadcasting organization represented, I might add some words to them too. I think my task is mainly to see, as I'm a lawyer, what are the rules in place in order to support the local content and the access to local content. From our perspective, there are, let's say, 2 main areas. One is the media environment or the official policy embedded in that one. And the other part is already touched upon by Paolo, the copyright system. To start with the first, there are different means within the regulatory framework to promote local content, and one element is already very often explicit, available in the public service remit of broadcasters. So even though the tasks which is given to public broadcasters on the national level may vary from one country to the other because it's not harmonized, and not even in Europe, very often there is an element where the focus on local content is put traditionally on news and current affairs, but you could, let's say, also indirectly see that promotion of the national identity and cultural diversity in the country also reflects on providing access to local content. Secondly, and probably most well known, are of course the regulations, the so-called quota rules, which deal with obligations for, let's say, producing and distributing or disseminating local productions. You may know the European Union has, since several decades, rules in place which obliges broadcasters to show a certain percentage of their programming consisting of European works. And these rules are in addition to national obligations which may exist in many countries for, let's say, their local productions. There is a discussion currently ongoing whether these obligations should expand or should be applied also to VOD services operators. That discussion is certainly not yet finished, but it might have some finalization next year. I guess that this point will be discussed by other parts of the panel. I'll not go further into detail. Another element, as you may know, is of course the government subsidies for local productions, tax incentives, etc. All of course subject to competition law rules such as state aid. And you may have, of course, rules on a national level which set certain restrictions on the foreign ownership of media, which of course indirectly also is a kind of protection of local productions. As I said, I will not go into further detail here. Basically, you have to be aware, of course, that this is a balancing act. On the one hand, these productions need to be protected. On the other hand, excessively, if these obligations are too excessive, you risk to endanger the viability of the broadcasting sector and also, of course, media pluralism. Coming to copyrights, I think the basic idea is, of course, what Paolo already said. There is the return of investment on investment. One of the main reasons why there is copyright, in fact, and that applies to local content as well. You could probably even go further and say, well, there is an intrinsic link with copyright protection and local production, since copyright is national in nature. So basically every country uses its own copyright laws in order to protect local right holders in the first place. Of course, the international private law rules within the copyright law can extend it to the protection of foreign works and foreign right holders, but in principle a country is allowed to discriminate. It can put its, let's say, its nationals better than others, unless, and that is where WIPO comes in, unless there is a treaty which, on the basis of the national treatment, prevents that from doing so. So very basically, copyright is very much adapted already to protect local content. And we also have to be aware that, especially on the piracy side, it has probably more negative effects for local productions than others, because local productions are very often more costly than just acquiring a license. And secondly, global productions maybe they have, let's say, more audience available, so they can be used for subsidizing other productions, whereas for local productions which have only a national audience or even very local audience will have more difficulties in that. So it makes it clear, I think, that copyright plays an important role. You could also look at, which is an important factor for the reason why so-called neighboring rights in copyright came into being. I'm sure you're not all lawyers in this room, but in copyright you have a distinction between the protection of works, protection of the authors of the works, the one hand, and protection of so-called related rights holders, such as, for example, phonogram producers and broadcasting organizations. Now, the type of protection for the latter two organizations is a bit different from the copyright, because the latter is more typically a protection of the investment. So it's not linked with the, let's say, moral connection of the author with his works, but is mainly to say, well, the phonogram producer, his outcome and his achievement is to get something on and to get the recording out there, and the broadcasting organizations, his task is to get programs to the public. But both are protected for, let's say, their activities as such, which of course is linked with the fact that they distribute and make accessible local content. It is never written anywhere. You can look at the materials where the Rome Convention came into being in 1960, but you will not see very much reasoning dealing with local content, but obviously in the back of the mind of people, that was one of the elements why it was thought that these neighboring rights should be coming to being. The final point, I think, is relevant, particularly for the current discussion we have at WIPO on the possible treaty for broadcasting organizations. Some of you may know that discussion is about whether to update the Rome Convention of 1960 into a modern legal instrument which would not only look at the traditional signals from broadcasters, but also looking at the, let's say, protecting the online signals of broadcasters. And this discussion is important nowadays because broadcasters see that the online transmission technology can be used in order to complement, supplement their traditional activities. And of course, here again, local content or niche content, which has small audiences, can be quite suitable for online distribution. But at the same time, of course, it needs then the same kind of protection as the traditional signals. I think I will leave it with that and hope that if there are any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you. I think it's my turn, is that right? My name is Bertrand Moulier. I represent the International Federation of Film Producers Associations. The anagram is the French one, FIAPF. In a nutshell, we are the sort of global family of film and television high-end production. We have as members national organizations of producers. For example, the Film Federation of India, of which my colleague Bobby Bedi is a member and a member of the governing board. We have the Egyptian film industry, we have the Nigerian film industry, we have the Canadians, we have most of the Europeans, we have the US, we have China, and so on. So we basically are the only organization that federates all the concerns and aspirations of the film production business worldwide. We meet twice a year in two large festivals where everybody tends to go, and we decide in common what the issues are. And what we're trying to do always is find ways of creating an environment, an enabling environment in which film and television production can take place in a manner that sustains jobs, enables people that run production companies to pay the rent and maintain their payroll, and hopefully have enough change left over to develop the next film or television program. I'll say a few words about the nature of the artifact that we're responsible for delivering to the viewing public, to consumers and citizens in a minute. But before I do, I travel around the world to work with colleagues in local film industries, and everywhere I go at the moment, I find that there is a huge amount of emphasis being put on the potential for film and television production sectors to help make serious contributions to GDP and growth. I was the guest at the Zuma Film Festival in Abuja, the capital of Nigeria, 2 weeks ago, where the culture minister, Mr. Lai Mohammed, reminded the audience in his opening speech that, according to estimates, the so-called Nollywood, the film industry at home, is now about 1.5% of GDP and growing as a result. This is a country that's looking to diversify away from oil production. It's decided to put specific policy emphasis on this industry, just to illustrate how important a lot of governments think this is as a pioneer sector, a future sector, a 21st century sector, a center of employment and growth and export earnings and so on. Just a few words about our product, which is very unusual. Film is an experiential good, you could say. You don't know what you're going to have until you get to the cinema or open up your Amazon account or others, or switch on your linear TV station. And so a lot of the risk is concentrated upstream of our process in what we call the development process. In fact, the jargon for it in our industry is development hell, for very good reasons, which is it's a time where you're actually spending money which often you don't have, in order to hope that somebody somewhere will pick up the rights and finance the script that you will produce out of your sheer talent and risk-taking. So first of all, it's a prototype. The risk is concentrated at the development period. Why we're always so very focused on trying to make sure we have clear pathways to market, clear pathways to the individual consumer, is because we need that relationship in order to finance that risk or to share it with others who are players in the value chain. So what key focus is the word I would like to focus on in discussion is really we're always looking for partnerships. So when we're looking at the so-called disruption caused by changes to value chains by the tech companies, the OTT services, we're looking beyond just having them as mere carriers of our content and mere licensees of it. We're looking for partnerships. We're looking to engage them the way we engaged legacy distributors and television stations in the past, to be partners in our development, in risk-taking, the financial and creative risk-taking that is ours. We have had, for example, the European Broadcasting Union has been a very interesting partner for the independent production business in Europe, in that it does participate in projects that we develop and agrees to pre-buy the rights that we will engage in the process of financing the new content. Local content is absolutely key. Everywhere we go, especially in our member organizations that come from developing countries, there is a real sense that this is a make or break time for local content, that it could either go in one direction, which is wall-to-wall content from abroad, which in itself is not, content from abroad is a good thing, but if it's only that, then what you're doing is starving the local industry of its ability to reflect, expand, dramatize social tropes and cultural tropes that are local and meaningful to local people. So what we're observing, for example, in two of the countries which we're engaged at the moment with, South Africa and Nigeria, is there's a real push for local producers to make what they make in a viable proposition. And for these, they need a certain kind of number of pre-existing regulatory conditions, if you like, and then I'll shut up after that. One of them is they need clear incentives to produce what they produce. There is a degree of market failure around local production, often, not everywhere, and Bobby will talk about a model where perhaps things are a little bit different. But in order to produce high-quality content that the people increasingly expect to see on their mobile phones or television sets or on the big screen, there needs to be mechanisms in place to help producers, and particularly with getting that first money in, which will convince other potential financiers to come in and support the content. The second thing is we need a copyright framework that makes sense, that supports, upholds substantive rights. In that respect, we're very encouraged by the decision by Nigeria recently to ratify the WIPO treaties, the copyright treaties, which will give substantive rights to authors, performers, and producers of content, and equally that South Africa is looking to do the same. We need meaningful enforcement of those rights, a proportionate, meaningful enforcement. That means that producers can create what they create and creators can create what they create with the relative safety of knowing that these assets will be protected for a period of time. And we need this, the copyright to be understood by the professionals themselves, which brings me on to my third kind of important component, which is the importance of training, professional training, so people that work professionally in this industry understand how the value chain operates, can assemble chain of title, and can turn their sweat and labor and talent into assets that are then they're able to utilize to keep their companies afloat and pay salaries and hopefully have enough, as I said at the beginning, spare change to develop the next project. So these are the kind of the key things that we're thinking about. One observation, which I know Bobby will expand on in a minute, is that we observe everywhere we go that it is filmed entertainment that drives the demand for broadband. It's film entertainment that drives the demand for connectivity. So there is really absolute sense, an organic sense, in developing partnerships with those new players in our marketplace, the OTTs in particular, but not only them, because it is in our mutual advantage for them to support us in generation of local content, in branding themselves in local markets and so on, and that knowing that it is really video content, entertainment content that actually drives this equation everywhere. And I'll hand you over to my colleague Bobby Beddy for a more detailed perspective from the seasoned practitioner that he is. Over to you.
Thanks, Bertrand. Ladies and gentlemen, this is my third IGF in a row. And the one key observation that I have is that there's a general feeling that it's a forum to discuss serious issues. Now, from where I come, entertainment is a very serious issue. It's a very serious business. It employs millions and millions of people, and it actually affects the lives of billions. So as Bertrand rightly said, it is actually the backbone under which the internet has developed and is now being used for many things, be it health, be it medicine, be it economics. I mean, it's a major, major, major highway on which everything is being traded. But the money for this highway, a lot of it, comes inspired by the entertainment business. So I think we need to understand that. So I've sort of absorbed what everyone has said so far, and I'm going to try to just digest it into a few pictures that I will paint, and leave all of you to think about them, and if there are questions, bring them up. But it will address most of the things that we have been talking about, or this session is about. So we've been talking about local content so far, right? I agree the word local is important, but it's also very important to understand that content in itself is critical, local or universal. Till some time ago, it was difficult to distinguish between what was happening in a country and across the world. That's changed a bit. But I'll still qualify that by saying that there are three kinds of content in my mind. Content that is free, genuinely free. People give it out of altruism. People want to share their experience, and a lot of the social networking and the YouTubes, etc., are based on that kind of content. And Wikipedia is one of the best examples of that. The second kind is content that is free till someone is prepared to pay for it. So every filmmaker who dreams of making a big series or a film is quite happy to do a free short film to showcase his or her talent, and then in the hope that once that talent gets recognized, then either through advertising support or other viewership returns or actual cash, he or she may end up making a living out of it, because that's the passion that drives them. The third, which is the sort of constituency that I represent, is quality content that is made only because audiences want to pay for it. This is high value, high quality content, and it goes across the world. Now, what's changed in this content of recent is the topic today, local and global. This content that used to be pretty much segmented, geo-segmented or linguistically segmented, has now traveled globally. In that process, it's created a demand for quality content across the world, and has resulted in different countries and different constituencies actually putting in resource to create high-quality local content. Technologically, it has become possible. Earlier, it was only through film print circulating, then it became through television, channels going through, and people opening different channels for broadcasting in different parts. Today, as was mentioned earlier, OTT has taken over, and OTT has actually changed the game a little bit, because OTT has made one piece of content specifically addressable to one member of the audience, wherever he or she might live. And that, in a sense, defines what local really means. And I'll explain it to you in an Indian context. India has always had local content because of its linguistic fabric. Films get made in 5 or 6 languages in India. They might be inspired by the West, but by and large, it's a native industry dealing with a native audience. This content was never getting to Indians wherever they might live, other than in very sort of concentrated pockets. So you could get an Indian cinema in New Jersey, or you could get an Indian cinema in South Hall or Wembley. But that was 5% of the audience. Today, because of the OTTs, without any reservation, a 50 million audience of very rich people of Indian origin, all of whom live outside the country, have access to the entire set of local Indian content. So in front of our eyes, global has become local, local has become global. Recently at a conference in Tokyo, I had the pleasure of meeting people from the Pacific Islands. Countries with populations in 10 to 12,000 was a country's population. 100,000 was Kiribati. Suddenly they all saw hope of the content that they created, getting the funding, getting the resource to improve its quality and reach across the world. So for me, there's a huge change that I've seen in the last couple of, maybe 5 years maximum, in India maybe 2 or 3 years, that tells us that there's a new game in town, there's a new playing field. We had the Indian producers, the studios came in not more than 7 or 8 years ago. They had their ups and downs and they're still playing over there. And now you have Netflix and you have Amazon and you have very recently Apple coming in and the music channels coming in. And they're coming in and producing local content. They're putting in large sums of money into local content, so they're happily helping local content improve. So for me, it's a great opportunity. Where it will rest, how they will compete with each other, where it will close on, we don't know. I've always sort of thought of some words of a song from my time to express my feelings, and today it's the turn of the Eagles, Hotel California. So it could be heaven or it could be hell. Let's find out what it will be. But just to finish, because we have discussed copyright, I mean, I don't think that any of this should mean that the need for copyright has in any way changed. In fact, it's very, very important today that I get recognized for one piece of my work being shown to one audience member and be rewarded for it. And if you can target one person sitting somewhere, then I'm sure you can account for the revenues from that one person in whatever form that it has to show up on my plate as a producer or in the distributor's plate or down the value chain. So it's a challenge to the lawyers, it's a challenge to the technologists, it's a challenge to the mathematicians. But if we can do it with our content, please, you can do it with your mathematics and your law. Get us there so that we are protected economically and this experiment becomes more heaven than hell. Thank you.
So, hello. My name is Elena Perotti, and I represent the World Association of Newspaper and News Publishers, One Infra. One Infra is based in Paris. We were founded in 1948. We now represent 118,000 publications in 120 countries around the world. And we were founded back in 48 with the double objective of defending and promoting press freedom, but also do everything in our power to help the sustainability of the industry. And the reason for this is that the economic independence of news media is a condition for the freedom of the press. A press which is not independent, which cannot sustain itself, is by definition going to not be free. So it is undeniable that quality journalistic content costs money, whether it is breaking news or in-depth investigative reports or even sports coverage or feature writing. And those costs are the salaries of journalists, of course, but also technical equipment, and in many cases, just keeping the journalists safe and sometimes alive while they're doing their jobs. So the media companies, in short, need to make profits in order to stay in business and to keep producing great content in conditions of freedom. Historically, one of the big pillars that allowed the news media to produce the stories that we all enjoy was advertising. But print advertising is decreasing dramatically. Over the last 5 years, we lost about 25% of it. In the same time, digital advertising, so the online revenues from digital advertising, has been slightly increasing, steadily increasing, but there are two problems with this. First problem is that the value of online advertising neighbors the 10% of print advertising. Then, of course, it is not increasing as fast as the print advertising is increasing, but most of all, very little of that revenue stays in the hands of the people who create content, news media in this case. Last year, for example, Google and Facebook captured 65% of the global digital advertising market. But most importantly, Google and Facebook share between them as much as 89% of all the new digital advertising spend. So today's digital landscape, of course, enables the mass reproduction and communication to the public of original content. But again, as I was saying before, the digital advertising income that that content creates stays in the hands of the facilitator of the sharing, which is, in this case, Facebook and Google. By reason of shared dimensions, local and regional publishers, of course, are even more at risk in this economic environment because they are much more vulnerable in the face of the tech giants, cannibalization of their market, because they're fatally local content producers are smaller and have less contractual power and are more prone to pressures. So for this reason, and to best explain to you from the field the struggles of creating content of good local value, we have brought to you a real professional journalist who lives this every day. He lives the struggle every day. He's Daniel Palmieri Bergamasco, the digital editor of Veja, which is a leading weekly magazine in Brazil. He's not here in person, but our colleague Dragana here has put everything in place for him to join us by both video and audio. So Daniel, the floor is yours. People, please, you need to put the headphones.
Yes, we can hear you.
Daniel? Daniel, this is Elena. Hi. Listen, the connection is not extremely good and we're a little over time. We are required to wrap up fast if this is possible. Is this possible, Daniel? Yes, we have one more speaker now, and if it is possible for you to close rapidly, okay? Thank you very much, Daniel. That's great. I'm giving the floor back to Paolo. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much. And, well, I guess a round of applause for the speakers. It's of you. But we apologize for the technical, for the low quality of sound. In any case, if you have any question, I guess we will be able to answer them. Actually, now we have finished with the list of speakers. We also have Giacomo Mazzone that joined us from the plenary that will is available for questions. And now is the time for your comments and your questions. Okay, we have 4 already. Perhaps we can get them all, or let's start with 2, and then the other 2. You go first. Sorry, if you could also introduce yourself before making the question, would be great. Thanks.
All right. My name is Adora Okoli. I'm from Nigeria, and I'm an Internet Society ISOC ambassador. So the speakers made wonderful points, and I just have a few questions. Now, you talked about, one of the speakers talks about partnerships with OTTs to address local content. And I was wondering, what do you suggest in terms of partnerships? If you could, make some suggestions for us, that would be very helpful. Then also, one of the speakers talked about advertising. I think the lady who talked about newspapers and publishing talked about advertising and all of that. So I'm wondering, what kind of new advertising models or revenue models should local content, local newspaper publishers adopt? Because one way or the other, the internet is actually helping in terms of cost, cutting down of costs, in terms of production, in terms of distribution. So what do you suggest in that regard? Then also, what do you suggest in terms of tackling issues of piracy? Because a lot of developing countries are facing those issues. So what do you suggest in terms of tackling issues of piracy? Because that's a major issue for developing countries in terms of local content.
The second set of questions.
Hi, my name is Bernhard Heiden. I'm here with the Copy Fighters campaign that engages with young people in Europe to talk about the need for an actual copyright reform that incorporates the realities of young people and a new cultural reality. I am, to put it mildly, surprised that this panel is set up with none of the people that are actually working with digital technologies to produce content. I would have hoped for something better, where there is actually an incorporation of the people that create culture in a new way that might not be understandable to old people, but that needs to be taken into account when copyright is being talked about. And what we have talked about with young people is that we actually need to go further than just calling for more and more protection of the rights holders, which are not actually the people that are creating the content in many cases, which of course need better contractual positions towards their employers and towards the big industry players here. But we have to talk about issues such as content filtering that are being proposed in the European Union that have devastating effects on freedom of expression, where when you upload things that you are allowed to upload, you might get blocked because it is seen by algorithms as a copyright infringement that do not take into account the exceptions and limitations of copyright, which need to be safeguarded for the public's right. Thank you.
Before giving the floor to the speaker, I just want to make we are not, the panel today was organized to address some specific issues, as I mentioned in the remark. I don't know whether you all know, I mean, we were looking at some specific issue about high quality industry, professionally led content, like movies, like news publishing and broadcasting. We're not pretending to be 100% comprehensive. And I also mentioned the importance of user-generated content. So we're not here to try to cover all the issues. Specifically, we're not at all trying to cover some sort of copyright reforms happening at the European level. In fact, we are trying to, we brought at the table representatives from other regions of the world that were sharing their experiences.
I can totally understand, but you're talking about local content, and local content is generated by people in most cases nowadays.
Of course. In fact, peoples are usually authors, performers, actors that dedicate their entire life in that. But I think we can take this discussion aside. Perhaps who wants to...
Just quickly to your question, Adora, on the partnering the OTTs. I think that's the very, very interesting developments. And artificially, I will refer to Nigerian market because you're from there. For example, if you take Iroko TV, which was kind of picked up by Canal+, so that meant they had a substantive injection of working capital. And they're able to optimize for the West African market in particular, for the diaspora as well. They started as a diaspora market, so the kind of Nigerian middle class abroad, but they're increasingly optimizing for Nigerians at home and the rest of West Africa, and pricing for the purchasing power locally, which I think is really interesting. And they're moving up the chain, partnering producers at development stage, getting involved at script stage and so on. And so in that sense, I think we see quite a lot of those developments at the moment. They're not the only ones. We have Unity, we have Showmax and so on, which the fact that it is a competitive sphere, I think is quite encouraging. To your point, I'm slightly saddened that you would think that the cultural new ways, as you describe them, are for young people, that old people don't understand them. I find that comment very ageist and quite contemptible.
Yeah, maybe also on OTT partnerships from the broadcaster perspective. Of course, to a certain extent, the broadcasters themselves develop those services in addition to the linear distribution channels. But we have certain, let's say, partnerships already in place, for example, with cable companies, and increasingly the cable companies are developing also additional services, non-linear, via the digital connection, and etc. And they would also be interested in, let's say, taking the programming from the broadcasters also in this way to their customers. So from that perspective, also from the broadcasting sector, there is movement in that direction, and certainly building on existing partnerships.
So addressing the question that was asked to me directly, yes, print advertising is declining, and online advertising is never going to be able to fill the gap of those revenues that are going away. What we could observe, though, and this is really a global trend, is that the revenues coming from the readers are increasing everywhere. So both in print, but particularly online and digital. the newspapers who have been selling online subscriptions for the longer time are now observing more than others the increase of these subscriptions. But in the case of the New York Times, for example, their subscriptions, online subscriptions, are now 70% of their subscriptions. So in the end, the solution to this revenue gap is not going to be found in advertising at all. It's going to be found, I think, in the day-to-day conquest of the trust of the public enough for it to be for the public to be willing to pay for quality news. That is basically the trend that we're observing right now. And by the way, there was a recent research from Schibsted in Norway, which discovered that the young generations are willing to pay for news. 30% of the ones that they have interviewed were people between 18 and 34 years old who realize, obviously, the importance of professional journalism, because this is what we are covering here, professional content creation, and they are willing to pay for it because they understand that otherwise either they pay for it or it's just going to stop sooner or later.
I think we had 2 more questions here. Please.
Okay, my name is Bredipta. I'm coming from Indonesia, and I'm here with the Internet Society Fellow. I would like to raise 2 remarks that may not have been mentioned previously by the panel. First, the fact that some of the local content itself does not have good quality. That's why many people prefer to have the foreign content, the abroad content. So, and the local content that we have only serves the public demand, the market demand. That prefers to have something more dramatic, something more not bringing up the issue of protecting the culture itself and protecting the local value that we have. And on this problem is also that the foreign content, the abroad content, has more attractive knowledge information that makes people who have this foreign information looks more cool, looks more informative than those who only receive local content. That's the first point. And second point, I don't see the point of having us to really protect the local content if it does not really bringing up the issue of protecting traditional expression, cultural knowledge, and so forth. Because after all, if what we are trying to protect is the only local production house that only creates content that does not really bring up the issue on cultural protection, then we will only have a local content that has been influenced by foreign influence. And so, yeah, I think, please help me to address this issue. Thank you.
So, we take also the 4th question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Victor. Thank you for the presentations. I'm from Kenya. My question is about the role of collecting societies. I'm concerned that in a lot of our markets, the CMOs the CMO system is broken, and it's affecting the ability of local content creators to actually monetize and to get transparent, accountable royalties. And from a legal perspective, I wonder, or from a policy or regulatory perspective, what could be done to address that?
Yeah, I can take the first set of questions. So I'm going to combine your 2 questions because at one level you say, is local content worth protecting if it's not serving a purpose? And the other side you're saying is that the foreign content has a particular influence on your society that you can't or may not think is desirable. So I think the way the system, the technology, and the economics are working is that more money is going to flow into the producing of local content. If more money flows into the producing of local content, see, India has not had that problem. India has always had money in the local content side, but many countries have not had that. But with the OTT, with the selective targeting, I think more money is likely to flow into the local content industry. And as a result, it will, over a period of time, answer both your points. A, the quality of content will increase and people will start respecting and watching local content more, and therefore it'll have its sort of fallout influences on the protection of culture, the protection of your art, or way you want it. The other is that the bringing in of foreign content in sort of multilingual targeted focus things actually improves the knowledge based and your overall taste in consuming content. So you start demanding more of local content. At the end of the day, local content will always score over international content if it's available at a high quality. And we've seen that in enough countries where resources have been put in. So I think that if this is allowed to happen, probably it will have a good fallout. But nobody knows for sure.
Okay, so regarding the collective management question, I think you are raising a very important point that is of interest in different regions of the world. It's not only a matter for developing country. In fact, it's an issue at stake also in Europe and the United States. In terms of developing country, I can share with you a recent experience which is linked to what Bobby was mentioning before. Is an experience made by individuals, I mean performers and singers of islands of the Pacific that have around, I mean Tonga, specific example of Tonga with 30,000 people, and they have performance group that share their videos on YouTube and they get millions of hits. The only way they can actually get remunerated and for further exploitation of that material online and offline would be through having a collective management organization, a functioning system. So those small countries are approaching WIPO and many other institutions and are asking themselves, how can we settle, can we create a functioning system? Well, it depends a lot on the concrete situation of the country. Probably for Kenya, you have a market size that enable a viable collective management system that needs to be transparent and led by the individuals. But it's a very complex area, but it's definitely a key one. For many individuals that are involved in the creation and of content, collective management is the only way to make to receive remuneration beyond direct contracting. So I'm sure Bertrand would add something more. In terms of WIPO is always ready to assist government on the basis of specific demands we receive, despite the fact that international treaties don't even cover the issue of collective management.
Yeah, thank you. So I think Bobby's answered fulsomely your point on local content, and I have nothing to add. On CMOs, I think we went to Kenya on 2 occasions. The last 2 spoke with colleagues there, and I think they share your concern about this. Does it function? Can it function? And what should it apply to? At least it's a sign of a maturing industry, because Riverwood was basically a kind of low-cost, high-volume phenomenon, which kind of happened in an informal way. It's formalizing, and you're making bigger films and more of them, etc. So that kind of problem arises when that happens. Well, we would simply say that in audiovisual, there is less call for collective management in mature markets than there is, for example, with music, where a lot of it is managed in this way. And that it's very important in film that you think about how you generate your primary revenues through face-to-face negotiation, value-based negotiation. In that respect, what our colleagues in Kenya were saying, the big problem at the moment is public broadcasters are not paying for what they get. And if you could sort out that primary market, then the rest should hopefully fall into place.
Any more comments or questions? Okay, at the end.
Hi, Eduardo from Copy Fighters. I was wondering about the newspapers field, and you mentioned that there is a problem about online advertising, and Google and Facebook having 89% of the advertising market. So my question is, why are you helping them to keep that share by requiring a link on the text, a text on links, for example, in Germany and Spain, and maybe in all Europe in the future. In one of these countries, the market decided that Google could have a free license. So everyone else would have to pay, but Google, because it's so important, got a free license. That situation will make all the market, and will reinforce the Google position. It will be way worse for you. So I'm asking, what is the logic behind it? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, it is obviously a very confusing situation, the one you were talking about. You were specifically speaking about a reform that happened in the German news media market that didn't work very well in Germany, but it worked pretty well in Spain instead, and it is at the basis of the lobbying negotiations that is happening right now at the European Commission level, and with which we are not directly involved because, again, we are global and not European. We are, of course, just trying to find a proper reaction to the overpowering of position of Facebook and Google. The solution is not in our hands, but the obvious answer to it is that they need to pay for content like everybody else. And that is what our European colleagues have been trying to make them do. That is all that I can say to you about it.
Largely over time, unless there are some very pressing issues, I think we can wrap up the session. Perhaps we can take advantage of the fact there is no one at the end and give you like 30-second concluding remarks. Otherwise, you had anything to add on the panel? I think we had a very rich exchange, and the whole point of organizing this session at the IGF is actually to receive inputs and openly discuss these very important matters that are actually not only, strictly speaking, copyright issues, but is mostly about creating a sustainable environment for the creation of culture in all nations of the world. It's not really only a copyright matter. So with that, I would really like to thank all the speakers that are here and that are connected with us through the internet, and all the participants that stayed with us during the lunch break. So I think you better run and get the last sandwich before it's over. Thank you very much. Yeah.